So a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined for the 9th and for now, the final talk of the Medical Humanities Colloquium for this season. And we've had a very wide range of conversations from, very different angles within the field, medical history, at least, let's say, touches of medical sociology. There has been a very strong interest because of the coordinators, I guess, in medical humanities and literature. We've had conversations on medical theater, conversations on, in fact, cinema as well, or at least camera in a certain sense. It'll be very interesting to close this seminar series for now, at least, with another presentation on literature and narrative medicine. And it's wonderful that we have Claire Jeantils with us as the presenter today. And I'll hand it over to Swati, who's the co-organizer for this seminar series, and Swati will introduce Claire. Thank you, Claire, for making the time, and over to you, Swati. Thank you.
Good morning or good afternoon from wherever you are joining, or good evening, I think, in India, because it's 5 p.m. It's very weird, I think, but we are all good with coffees at the moment. So I'll just introduce Claire now. Claire Jeantils is a third-year PhD student from CNRS, Sorbonne Nouvelle, in modern literature, specializing in medical humanities. She researches epilepsy in French and British contemporary literature. Drawing on epileptological knowledge, she aims to underline the narrative features of the disease and to suggest a literary epistemology of the use of narrative medicine in the medical follow-up of epilepsy. She is in charge of the PhD students' network, my apologies, of the Medical Humanities IRN of CNRS in France. After a 10 months placement at the Maison Française d'Oxford, she's now back in Paris teaching literary analysis at Sorbonne Nouvelle. Her work is supervised by Alain Schaffner, Sorbonne Nouvelle, and Catriona Seth, All Souls College. Claire, we're really glad to have you.
Thank you so much, Swati. So yes, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you to my dear friend Swati for organizing this, and to Arka, her supervisor, for making this possible. I'm always excited about new opportunities to share ideas around medical humanities. And as I understand it, the situation is quite similar in France and in India, as we don't have lots of researchers and we don't have lots of courses in medical humanities, but it doesn't make our insights less valuable. And I guess that sharing our ideas together and our methodologies is a great way to implement a critical lens in the discipline. So now I'm going to share my screen, and let me know if it works, please. Oh, I guess now Swati is co-host, so you have to allow me to share my screen, if it's possible. Okay, thank you. So here we go. So does it work? Yes, okay, perfect. So today I'm going to present to you my PhD research and the methodological issues that arise from it. First and foremost, I want to precise something which is very administrative, but it's very important. So in France, medical humanities doesn't exist as a discipline, so you cannot enroll at university as a PhD student in medical humanities. So administratively speaking, I'm a contemporary literature PhD student, but my job contract, my PhD contract at CNRS, which is the National Scientific Research Center in France, is in medical humanities. So it already proves the interdisciplinarity of my research, as well as the current situation in France regarding the discipline, as I was saying. So I'm going to show you a few pictures in this presentation that are all from the picture series Electric Visions by Anne-Lynn Lindsay. She's a photographer based in Edinburgh. And those pictures are drawn from her own lived experience of epilepsy. And I think that it can help you, if you don't know anything about epilepsy, to kind of picture the experience. So it is with this administrative ambivalence in mind that I'm going to present my PhD research, which is entitled Literary Representations and Apprehension of Epilepsy. So I grew up with a dad who had epilepsy, and up until he died in 2015, I grew up as a caregiver, if you will. I had no scientific knowledge whatsoever about the disease. It was only an experiential knowledge, I would say. I didn't know anything about other people's experience of epilepsy or about other types of epilepsy. I had no idea about that because I didn't have any time to care about that. In 2018, on the verge of writing my master's dissertation, I discovered narrative medicine. So narrative medicine, for those who will know, is a medical practice which was developed in the early 2000s in the United States by Rita Charon. This technique postulates that the acquisition of narrative skills by caregivers allows them to receive the patient's story as it is, and thus improves the medical encounter. To do this, narrative medicine proposes to train caregivers in literary analysis and creative writing. So right away, when I discovered that, I was fascinated by the fact that physicians would go towards literature, would go towards literary analysis to try and improve their own practice. And because, of course, spontaneously, I was thinking about my father's illness and its links to narrative. I thought about all the time spent listening and trying to understand what and how he felt during the seizure. I remembered how confused, isolated, and sad he seemed to feel, but mostly I remembered how important those moments were because they helped him to make sense of the experience, but also to reconnect with us. And so to share his experience of the seizure and to complete ours because we were eyewitnesses. Thus, these moments helped us create an intersubjective narrative of his epilepsy. So it was easy to see that narrative medicine could have been an interesting addition to his own medical follow-up. But learning about it at Columbia, I felt like it needed to be taken very carefully and that it required adaptations for patients with epilepsy. And this is how this whole project began. So coming from the literary side of things, I decided to focus on a contemporary corpus of text to allow for a contemporary representation and understanding of the disease. Indeed, a few pieces of research in French literary studies about epilepsy focus on Flaubert or even on Dostoevsky in comparative research, which are both dated approaches to epilepsy. They also tend to confuse hysteria and epilepsy, something that I wanted to avoid, obviously. And moreover, as I knew a little bit about medical humanities in the UK, I wanted to broaden my horizon. And so I choose to compare and contrast French and British texts. The goal of my thesis, is to analyze both French and British texts, contemporary literary representations of epilepsy, that is to say from the 1980s to 2018. In doing so, I wish to unveil the inherent links between epilepsy and narrative with a back and forth methodology between the medical necessity and the increase of contemporary narratives focusing on the neurologic. And this will allow me to suggest a narrative, a critical and informed use of narrative medicine in the therapeutic follow-up of epilepsy. So in this presentation, I'm going to explain my methodological standpoint, how I put together my corpus, and finally, the main analysis methodologies that I use to tackle each text. Let's start first with a medical definition of epilepsy. Epilepsy is a chronic neurological illness. It is characterized by moments of abnormal electrical activity in the brain. And these moments are manifested by seizures that can vary greatly from one patient to another, or even from one moment to another in the patient's life. They can be convulsive or even absences. It is estimated that 65 million people worldwide suffer from epilepsy, that is to say roughly 1 person in 100. In almost 50% of the cases, the causes of the disease are unknown. For the rest of this presentation, let us remember that epileptic seizures and epilepsy on a daily basis can have three major consequences on the patient. First of all, memory impairment, then a senses impairment, and an ontological one. This is why epilepsy can generate narratives of forgetfulness, confusion, involuntary lying, and, as you probably already understood, impairment. The notion of impairment allows me to describe an interstice, an unthought, I would say, of the patient experience and their narrative. The impairment in the context of epilepsy comes both from the bodily confusion and the narrative dysfunction. It is then a question of narrative impairment, as described by Jean-Marie Schaeffer, as being, and I quote, the region of the narrative regime where our common categorizations are taken in defect, the situations in which the canonical notion of the narrative is disturbed. So this non-canonicality allows us to better grasp the canonical forms of the narrative, Schaeffer tells us. Indeed, the analysis of this text makes me reflect on the canonical forms of illness narrative and situate epilepsy narratives in this landscape. But even here, the attempt to formally define epilepsy narrative as an impairment narrative, bodily and narratively speaking, is unsatisfactory because it generalizes types of epilepsy and their symptoms. It postulates necessary and sufficient conditions for the seizure. However, I do not want and cannot postulate such a model in which would claim to encompass all epilepsies without stigmatizing them and formulating even maybe an epileptic essence. They are forms of epilepsy in some patients who accumulate the three main sequelae I talked just before, present, and others in whom these sequelae are not yet developed or will never be. Thus, impairment is not always an adequate category for defining this text. Just as there is not one epilepsy, but many epilepsies, there is not one prototypical account of epilepsy, but many accounts of many epilepsies. Even when symptoms are similar from one patient to another, they are not experienced in the same way from one individual to another. The idea then is to welcome the narratives as they present themselves and to analyze what they say about the experience of epilepsy today, while reflecting on how they remodulate the boundaries of canonical illness narratives. It is in these in-betweens, and because these texts in their diverse and innovative forms question the prototypical or the canonical forms, that it is particularly relevant to study them from a literary perspective. But contemporary epilepsy narratives so far have been only studied in psychiatric or medical point of view. What my thesis proposes to do is to, I would say, slip into the gap to present a form of hybridity that both accommodates the notion of narrative in a medical context, or rather, I would say the notions, to give it importance, to recognize the literary and social values of published narratives of epilepsy, but also that it recognizes the specificities and varieties of experiences of epilepsy. As Alexandre Geffen explained, contemporary literature calls for a pragmatic approach to be analyzed because it brings up themes that require reparation. as it's the case for people with epilepsy, because it seems that they always have been stigmatized. Hippocrates in the 4th century before Christ already attested that. This text topic require more than a stylistic approach to be analyzed. To understand epilepsy stories, I need to understand how the disease works. I need to know about the comorbidities possible. I need to know about different types of epilepsy, etc., etc. Otherwise, I might miss some links and references and see only strange forms, strange literary forms, and not any kind of biological links. And this is why my methodology is necessarily impacted by all that, and that it goes towards the medical humanities. Epilepsy, the disease in itself, is the framework of my thesis. It circumscribes my research. It opens many doors, of course, because there is a great variety of symptoms, but it also poses many limits. And this interdisciplinary stance allows me to show to what extent the epileptic experience is linked to the notion of narrative. The permanent dialogue between what I learn from my corpus on one end and what I learn about the disease on the other shows that cultural representations shed light on the lived experience, bringing another form of phenomenological knowledge. To link this research to the medical humanities is also to become aware of and use the medical historical aspect of the disease, to recognize that this also sheds light on contemporary representations of epilepsy. It is not only biomedical, it is also inscribed in a context, I would say, a history, which is very long and overloaded with cliché, and etiologies, each more dubious and extravagant than the next. And finally, this link with medical humanities makes it possible to think of the creation of the corpus as also being for the benefit of people with epilepsy themselves. It is useful to promote this corpus. I am highlighting the current state of medical and sociocultural treatments of the disease to promote a better representation of persons with epilepsy. So now let's focus on the constitution of the corpus. Roughly, what types of texts am I dealing with? Well, they are autobiographies, fictions, autofictions, graphic novels, and even song lyrics. The forms of epilepsy stories are varied because epilepsies are varied, and their experiences as well. Showing diversity through the corpus helps to promote a better representativeness. I chose 3 examples in my corpus to explain to you, to illustrate what am I talking about. So this is an excerpt from La Parenthèse by Élodie Durand, which is a graphic novel about a young woman who suffers from epilepsy because of brain cancer. As she suffers and loses her memory more and more, her drawings become less traditional, I would say, for a comic strip, and words tend to disappear. And the page shows the weight, literally, of the disease she carries around. The second example I am going to show to you today is a song by Anthony and the Johnson, Epilepsy is Dancing, that I suggest we can listen together. It's just 2 minutes.
Epilepsy is dancing, she's a Christ now departing, and I'm finding my rhythm as I twist in the snow. Or the metal binding me down the brain of my river, or the fire was searching for a waterway home. I cry, glitter is love. My eyes hidden inside with green jewels, hanging like Christmas stars from golden veils. As I came to a screaming, oh, meanwhile I'm dreaming, for my fingers are curling, and I cannot breathe. Then I cried in the kitchen, how I seen you go switching. There's a soldering blue line between my eyes. Cut me in quarters, leave me in the corner. Cut me in quarters, leave me in the corner. Cut me in quarters, leave me in the corner. Cut me in quarters, leave me in the corner. Ooh, now it's passing. Ooh, now I'm dancing. Ooh, now it's passing. Ooh, now I'm dancing. Ooh, now it's passing. Ooh, now I'm dancing. Ooh, now it's passing. Ooh, now I'm dancing.
So I chose this song out of the three I studied in my research because I found that Anthony and the Just Sons song here really challenge precisely the other musical representations I study, which are two songs by Joy Division, She's Lost Control and Disorder. Here the music doesn't resemble post-punk at all and changes the idea we can have of epilepsy. And it's even at some point kind of lyrical, even calm, I would say. The voice of the person with epilepsy is reassuring and seems to lead the person next to them to help as they need to be. In this short song, we have summed up all the different sensations the singer experiments with whilst seizing. It's both a dance and also the biggest fatigue. It's both sadness and glitter.
Epilepsy.
The final example from my corpus I want to look at and read with you today is an excerpt from Electricity by Ray Robinson. Electricity tells the story of Lily, a young British woman who struggles with epilepsy and difficult family issues at the same time. Here, the familiar tone of the excerpt and the rhythm of the text enable us to perceive the rapidity of the scene and build upon some kind of suspense. I quote, "It was coming, such strong motion. I squeezed somewhere deep inside, told it to go away. The old man and some others had their hands on me, dogs spinning in circles, barking, hallooing away. A moon-faced woman above me was blowing bubbles, fretting, 'Oh, love, what it is, love.' And I knew that soon I'd be down there, lying in a puddle of piss and sweat. Ugh, people would be stood over me, faces looming out of the dark after fuzz, not knowing what the fuck to do. The old man pulling the dog off from licking me." So with Electricity, we perceive the intersubjective aspect of the epilepsy experience. Whilst feeling like she's losing control, to use a Joy Division expression, she has this, at the same time to take into account people and strangers around her. Capital letters are used along the novel either to express the loud voices around Lily or the loss of senses when the seizure comes up. And that's what you can see both on the book cover and even in the text. Solitude, ambiguity, and shame are all showcased in these examples. That proves how varied and complex experiences and narratives of epilepsy can be. It also helps deconstruct preconceived ideas of what an epilepsy narrative looks like. What these texts have in common is that they describe the daily experience of living with epilepsy. They show the ambiguity of a chronic seizure state. The fact that you get used to some kind of weird bodily rhythm and at the same time never control anything. They also highlight one or more seizures and they all represent the disturbance that the illness generates in the constitution of the narrative of the self. So I, therefore, allow myself to look towards fiction because there is a certain plasticity about this genre and language. Fictional representation is also interesting because it can potentially use epilepsy as a metaphor or as a narrative prosthesis. That is to say, when a text uses a disability to address issues of radical otherness, and this is something that is very important to highlight and critique as well. And probing this type of text also says a lot about the evolution of the stigma of the disease. Secondly, and also because it might seem counterintuitive that to understand the experience of an illness, we should look at the side of fiction. This is because the use or not of fiction to approach a pathological topic shows the extent of its literary and cultural representativeness and what it is shown of epilepsy. To say that I cannot study fictional texts to think about epilepsy and its experiences is to refuse epilepsy to be fully literary, to forbid certain territories that it already borrows and which are culturally accepted for other pathologies. So, of course, there is the question of patient's narrative collected in a medical context. Why not include some in my corpus? First of all, for a very logical reason, because of the health crisis, to consider this type of encounter is very difficult right now, but also mostly because they do not fit in my corpus, I would say, because the elements of the main corpus are linked by a wish to publish, either on the part of the patient themselves, who tell or let themselves be told by others, or on a part of the author, who would be outside of the disease and who would be interested into representing the illness. The willingness to publish necessarily implies an intention to share and therefore to impact others in a specific way. Patients do not present themselves or write in the same way when they know that their story, oral or written, will be published on a large scale. Moreover, that kind of testimony would require both ethical approvals, but also a kind of expertise and methodology and some kind of training on my part that I don't have and I do not wish to simulate. So contacting patients for interviews and or writing workshops with patients or caregivers is one of the postdoc possibilities that I am looking into, but it's not right now in my PhD research. So in addition to stylistic or narratological literary analysis, I need to find tools that allow me to embrace the diversity of forms and contents in the corpus I study. To do this, I have been thinking about the specificities of illness narratives compared to what I find in epilepsy narratives. And this guided me towards two approaches. The first one is the phenomenological approach, and the second one is narrative medicine. The phenomenological approach to text investigates how characters think, perceive, and come into contact with the world. It can also help thinking about the conditions of production of the non-fictional narrative, pay particular attention to body-mind relationships, and highlight the interpersonal relationships present or which underpin the texts. Finally, it is a more corporeal, more embodied analysis, which is quite adequate to underline the importance of the turning points in the patient's daily life, such as the pre- and post-diagnosis, the pre- and post-seizures phases. This echoes with topics that are increasingly present in contemporary literature, including in fiction. Patricia Vaux theorized the genre of the neo-phenomenological novel, which, being at the crossroads of psychiatric and neurologic, brings to light this type of body-mind dialogue, which is put in a very reflexive way. To deepen this approach, I could also reflect on microphenomenology. Microphenomenology is a discipline, a kind of method that suggests analyzing experiences very precisely. I quote Claire Petit-Mangin. What's happening when an idea comes to us, when suddenly a childhood memory comes back, when we feel sad or, on the contrary, elated, when we enter a forest, listen to a piece of music or taste a good wine, when we read a novel or write a letter. These phenomena, which constitute the very texture of our existence, are difficult to describe and have thus far been excluded from scientific investigation. Microphenomenology opens up new ways to learn to describe our own experiences and to pay attention to them very differently. I could perhaps find there new levers for my textual analysis. It could also be very interesting to implement microphenomenology and narrative medicine in a medical curriculum for neurologists and epileptologists. Secondly, narrative medicine, as I talked about it previously. If I wish to propose a critical literary study of narrative medicine in the therapeutic follow-up of epilepsy, I also use it as a tool for textual analysis. The literary analysis technique of narrative medicine is called close reading. It suggests basing its analysis on 5 elements: frame, form, time, plot, and desire. So I'm going to explain in a few words what it means exactly. About frame, here is about how the reader frames the text when they locate it. Who is the writer and from where do they write, to whom is this text addressed, etc. So how is it useful to wonder about that when dealing with the text about epilepsy more precisely? Well, because with that kind of corpus, we can be tempted, coming from a literary background, to focus on the point of view of the narrator and all that kind of things, which are very interesting, but it's not enough. So at the same time, we can forget totally about the biomedical aspect of things. And on the contrary, from a medical point of view, we can totally forget about the question of the point of view of the narrator, etc. So focusing on the frame of the text helps also us wonder about our methodological frame and interact with the text as it is and not just as we picture it. About the form, it is about the genre of the text, which is linked, of course, to the frame, but it also has to do with the structure of the text, the position of the narrator, the metaphors present in the text, or even the allusions. And also it investigates the diction, that is to say, the register of language. It's just like what we did when we read Electricity together. Then time, Rita Sharon explains that readers who pay disciplined attention to order, duration, story time, discourse time, and velocity can enter that narrative world with new ease. It helps understand the text's inner chronological structure, of course, and look at the period in time where there have been differences between the before and the after diagnosis, the sensations of sickness and health, this idea of before it started or since it started, etc. Then what about the plot? This is basically about looking for what happens in the text. However, the notion of the plot when reading autopathographies about chronic disease is far different from reading for the plot in a crime novel. There is no suspense at all, as the following of the illness, it will never disappear. So of course the plot is kind of different. So it is very much about looking at the way events like a seizure or daily life considerations are twisted together rather than looking for a resolution. And finally, desire. So Rita Sharon's ask, what appetite is satisfied by virtue of the reading act? So what desires did the writer express through this text, and what was the experience of the reader? It is a way for me to wonder about what happened within me whilst reading as a researcher, but also as a former caregiver. It helps me to situate myself in my research. Moreover, adopting this approach for my corpus allows me to think about what is not present in these texts and to evoke the expectations of different types of readerships about narratives with a relationship to epilepsy. Also, it allows me to avoid overinterpreting what the patient or caregiver is saying in the text and to avoid reproducing a stigma. I have to take into account really the context in which the story was produced. Now it's time for me to conclude. I realize that I'm really learning a lot, methodologically speaking, from the disease and the text themselves. Working on a chronic neurological illness requires patience and acceptance. The texts vary a lot, but that doesn't mean they don't have commonalities. It only means that the connections are different from those that might be found in a more canonical or prototypical corpus. The methodology I use is experimental, and I consider my thesis as a methodological suggestion for the medical humanities. And I hope it resonated with you and will with a wider audience once it's finished. Fingers crossed. Many questions are still open. I mean that what I presented today is my work in progress. However, my outreach activities with the medical center La TEP in France, which welcomes patients with epilepsy, give me good hope that my advice to adapt care according to the patient's experiential knowledge is going to be heard one day. So thank you very much for your attention and again for having me.
Thank you so much, Claire.
All the best, Claire, for the rest of your doctoral journey. Right?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for contributing to the series.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye. Bye. Bye, everyone. Bye.